Hello, everybody. My name is Mirko Novakovic. I am co-founder and CEO of Zero, and welcome to Code Red. Code, because we are talking about code, and Red stands for requests, errors, and duration, the core metrics of observability. On this podcast, you will hear from leaders around our industry about what they are building, what's next in observability, and what you can do today to avoid your next outage. Today, my guest is Eric Futoran. Eric is the CEO and co-founder of Embrace, a mobile observability tool built on OpenTelemetry and hyper-focused on the client side of observability. Eric previously co-founded Scopely, the largest US mobile game publisher, which later sold for $5 billion. I'm glad to have you here, Eric. Welcome to Code Red.
No, thanks for having me. I really appreciate it.
Great. And we always start with our first question, which is, what was your biggest Code Red moment?
I was thinking about this one. There's quite a few, and founders don't necessarily like to talk about them. But I feel like founders always like to talk about the rosy moments. So I love the question. Early in Embrace's lifespan, we worked with a large fantasy sports app. And so if you think about what especially observability companies, but data companies, want, like their ideal customers and their ideal growth path is kind of a nice line. And on a day-to-day basis, when you take in data, you don't want spikes. It's just not what you built for. But if you think about fantasy sports, I give huge kudos to my co-founder, Frederick. Fantasy sports, their biggest days are Sundays, and they spike heavily. The biggest day is actually Thanksgiving, which is the last day you'd ever want to spike. But think about the spikes. Everybody logs in like at halftime, right before the game, and then they log off. So these huge spikes, we'd have like 30 to 100x traffic and only of certain types, usually a lot of ads, so a lot of network API traffic, where we're, as an observability company, collecting everything, crashes, errors, logs, the traditional open telemetry metrics, but also like non-traditional enrichment type metrics, like data types, metrics is the wrong word, like ANRs, network data, which is usually in both a span and a metric form. And then we put it all in this one big session payload. Like the core of Embrace is every session for every user, because in mobile, everything is unique and very cardinal. So ultimately, if you really want to solve a problem, you want to look up the user and just see what they'll happen. And we'll get to that later. But that's crazy for these crazy network traffic spikes. And then our backend this was 2019-ish. We were using ClickHouse. We still do. But if you think about it, that's bleeding edge. ClickHouse, even before the big company ClickHouse really existed. And so the Code Red was basically the first Thanksgiving, everybody was on deck. Like once we hit that network spike and really weren't ready for it, as much as we'd like to be, we weren't. We were ready for just adding a new customer, even at volume, sharding your database, like preparing for it. But when you spike and you get these payloads, like they blitzed us. And so we were large session payloads coming in. The latency was hitting everything. Like our crash pages were slower. Our user lookup was slower because everything was loading into the database slower. And so we could either do like smaller chunks, which load faster, but are really complex. We could do bigger chunks, which is what most companies do. But you get latency, but it's more efficient and easier to support. Blah, blah, blah. It sucks. And so to finish it up, the way we solved it is not necessarily more databases, which is where most people kind of land, which obviously is inefficient, more costly, and kind of against the open telemetry stack. We just did a bunch of stuff, like obviously decoupled the session payloads. So sessions, every user has multiple sessions, breaking those up into their constituent parts. We decoupled a lot of the loaders. We did a bunch of more sharding, like a bunch of crap. It never really solved the problem because you end up like most 6 out of 7 days a week, right? You have normal loads, and then this one day you don't. So it's just not an ideal customer, even though they're still with us today. But it was fun, air quotes fun.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great story. And yeah, let's talk about mobile observability overall, right? I think I was thinking about it. I first used it. There was a company called Criticism.
Yes.
Which then turned into Apptelligent. I was a reseller actually in Europe. One of their they got acquired by VMware. And that's probably, I don't know, let me guess.
That was a long time ago.
10, 12 years ago. And that was kind of the first time I saw mobile observability. But when I was preparing for this call, I was thinking, everybody's talking about mobile first, right? So most of the apps these days, if I use my bank or whatever, I mostly use it on my mobile phone with a dedicated app. But for most observability players, including Dash Zero, but also most of the others, it's barely a core use case to do mobile observability, though it is so important. So do you know why that is? I don't really know, but it is really like that, right? For probably every vendor has something there, but it's more or less a side project. So Embrace is really focused on that topic, right? To help developers of mobile apps figure out their problems.
There are a couple questions in there. If you think about that intelligent criticism Crashlytics time period, that was super early.
That was free, right? That's a Google free tool, right? Crashlytics
now it is. Firebase acquired Crashlytics from Twitter, which acquired Crashlytics, which is crazy.
Yeah.
And it's doing okay as part of Firebase. You get what you get for free. But the good product for crashes, that was just too early. Like, if you think about when most game companies and most big mobile companies, the original like first wave per se was like 2012, 13, that all you cared about was just, can I get an app out there? Because for every person that had a problem like a crash, there were 10 other people buying phones and downloading apps. So you didn't care about optimization. And I don't even think of them as observability companies. I mean, the word wasn't even really coined until like 2015, 16, I feel like. Second question. Why do the other players not think we use it or have like a mobile play? There are legacy ones like New Relic, Dynatrace, and Datadog primarily. I'd say they're run products built for the backend. So if you look at them and you go in, it's a DevOps. Their primary persona is DevOps and backend engineers. If you go in, you see that. Like, you see the traditional geo map of where your problems are. An individual client-side engineer doesn't give it anything about where it exists. They care about the problem and how acute is it, and maybe it's a certain set of users and how to solve it. There's a bunch of error logging products, the sentries, the bug snags, the roll bars, but it's error logging. So crash is basically a form of error, but they're known issues. It's not really RUM. RUM and observability in the observability world is collecting every session, all the data, not sampling it, not removing the cardinality to make it aggregates, which is what backend tools do. So you can actually measure and optimize effectively and then prioritize based on impact. And I don't think a lot of tools do that. So why aren't they focused on it? To be honest, I think in today's world, I mean, it's part of the reason Dash Zero is there. There are kind of two opportunities in the stack. Like, the back end is totally getting disrupted. And OpenTelemetry is definitely helping that, right? It's standardizing the tool sets in some ways so that you can have new players like yourselves and Grafana and Chronosphere that can go disrupt the older legacy players that say they're doing OpenTelemetry, but they're really not. They just do it as a marketing FUD just because they have to. Otherwise, their brand diminishes. I'm happy to say that because it's the truth. And they're closed ecosystems, which we'll probably talk about. Or it's the mobile client side. Like in OpenTelemetry, the goal is to standardize the data, right? So all the teams are talking the same language. And so for us, the play is, how do we standardize with these other players like us and Grafana, us and Chronosphere, us and whatever, Snowflake even, and provide that same data layer and standardization. So why aren't they focused on it? I think it just can't focus on everything.
Yeah.
You need it because you're right. The biggest companies today are mobile first. Like we have every hotel chain, Marriott, Hilton, Hyatt. While you don't think of them that way, how do you interact with them? It's on your phone. Or you go to a kiosk when you're inside. That's an Android device. You go to a terminal by talking to somebody at the front desk. It's often an Android device. Like, it's all mobile now. So you need a mobile story. And obviously that's our bet.
Let's talk how it works, right? And I'm not a professional here, but as far as I know, you have kind of an SDK, right? There's not really something like an agent because you can't really deploy an agent on every phone. So it's basically the developer of the app uses your kind of SDK during build or compile time, and it's integrated into the app. So if you put the app into the App Store, basically the Embrace SDK is inside, and then the data is collected basically as part of the app that's deployed, and then the data is sent to your backend, correct?
Yeah, I love that you said agent. For the sophisticated folks in the audience, if you see somebody use an agent methodology mobile run, the idea of collecting the data is correct, but the process of putting an agent, just because Android's Java doesn't mean you put a Java-based agent there. You'll blow up the user's experience and not collect the right data, right? Backend Java is very different than client-side or Java and Kotlin, really, at this point. But yes, so we're one of the primary approvers and maintainers, both on the Swift and the Android, but we've forked both of them because it's not good enough in mobile and client side in general just to do logs, metrics, traces. There's tons of other data and other areas you have to enrich that data, which makes it nuanced. So you use our SDK. It's Kotlin Android, which is Kotlin or Java, iOS, which is generally Swift. There's a React Native, there's a Unity, there's a Flutter, there's a primary native, I'd call, languages for mobile, and you use an SDK. And then you use this in compile time. I'd say 90% of the data is automatically collected because it's really hard to instrument. Another reason to go to a mobile-first company, instrumentation sucks in mobile. Really sucks. Sucks on web, too. Just not a lot of standardization of components and ways of collecting the data. Even like thinking about startup, every app has a different kind of where they think that startup ends. Yeah, and then it compiles, and then you deploy us into production, which is where we're best.
And then you get different types of data, right, on the app. So we started the conversation with Crashlytics and criticism, which were at the beginning all focused on crash reports, right? I mean, we all know it, right? You download an app, you open it, it crashes or it has something, and you wanted to know why and on which iOS device or Android device in which cell phone and whatever, right? But that's kind of the basic thing a developer probably wants, right, from the apps to know when it's crashing, and that you provide that.
That's the step one, I'd say, in the evolution of mobile. Like crashes is because if it crashes, it's an obvious thing that you can measure and solve. To be honest, like a good app's crash rate's like 99.99 or 98 or 95 crash free. So it's a problem you should track, and we obviously do it, and we do it, which is a little different. We both do it at the native layer, but if you're using like a React Native, a Flutter, or Unity, we do both because they're layered and can happen in either layer or can happen in the Unity layer and then throw something in the native layer. And it's good to have all the information. The evolution then became like, okay, I've solved the majority of my crashes. How do I solve the hard ones as opposed to the ones where the line of code is kind of obvious? Then you need the information that led up to it, which is part of the origin of Embrace. And then maybe it was a network call or an error earlier in the session that was handled, but still created a state that caused a crash later. It's hard to couple those things. And in error logging tools, there tend to be different errors that aren't fully coupled. So you don't really get to see it. Or in traditional RUM solutions, they're totally separated. The next is, okay, what are the other types of errors that are actually more impacting for my users that I should be tracking or should be building DevOps SLOs around? For like a high scale scrolling app like a Pinterest, it could be like stutters or where people can't scroll as quick because they know it impacts revenue. Or for games, it could be ANRs, which are like basically the equivalent of a freeze. They're really hard to solve. And the Google Store only detects when they end, not when they start. When they start is when the line of code is. And so it's like, how do you connect the dots to things beyond crashes? The long story short.
There are basically two parts, right? One is the app on the phone, running on the phone.
Yes.
And then there's communication from the phone, probably to a backend, right? I mean, there are offline apps, but there are also apps that do not work offline. So they have a connection. They send data back and forth. Can you work with both setups? So can you support apps that are offline and you can basically, I call it profile them on the phone, or only the ones that do have connection with the backend?
We do both. And majority of apps now don't have to be connected. They almost all of them have some sort of caching or some way to at least work temporarily offline. It's a really hard problem. If you think about it, the assumptions of the backend are different in that case. And so actually when highlights is like when we send the data to like a backend partner, the data can be really late. Like you could have a session, quote unquote session that's offline or maybe the person leaves and you don't get a chance to even send the data, even though it's online, for like a day or days. Most tools drop those on the floor because their backend processes expect everything to be synchronous and timely. And we have to figure out, okay, how do we kind of, if you think about we have to think about how to reorder it so that we can actually send the data effectively or even display it right in our dash. And for the technical people out there, think about the problem. Like, it's even how you store the data, how you think about it, how you shard it. It becomes really, really, really difficult. It's actually a core like IP for us in a lot of ways.
Yeah, it's interesting. We have similar issues like in the backend part when we have long running traces or asynchronous traces, right?
Yeah.
You never know, you have a trace, but you actually don't know if it's finished, right? Because a span could come very late, minutes. I mean, in our terms, sometimes 10 seconds is late, right? Because everything is real time. But I can imagine with mobile phones, they could be offline on a long flight or whatever, or you have no battery, and then they come back 3 days later and you send the data and then you still have to connect it, right?
Totally. And I think there's some assumption on the back end that your span or trace will finish.
Yes.
Because it generally will. But in mobile, they won't. I'm totally with you. Like, what if somebody just leaves mid startup, which you would have a span around your startup? Then what? Is that bad? Is that good? Like, is that a natural thing? Did it crash? Did it have like a network call or a third party vendor that froze the startup? Who knows? But yeah, we can't have that assumption. We actually displayed in like one of the things we analyze, which is different, is we look at those things like how we actually let you filter by spans that haven't finished, as opposed to waiting for it and then sending it back to our backend.
And the RAM part in OpenTelemetry is still very early, and it's more focused on web, right? But you still have chosen to use OpenTelemetry as your data format, right? So you're basically using the logs, events, the traces to package and send the data. So why have you chosen OpenTelemetry if it was not really set up for the mobile world, I would say?
I wouldn't say even the web is quite there from a RUM, right? Yeah, not to bash the folks there, but it is definitely nascent as from a maturity perspective, and they don't fully even either Android doesn't necessarily fully support all three types. And then there's events, and then there's concept of sessions and other types that OpenTelemetry is talking about. Why do we choose OpenTelemetry? I think the primary value for us is connecting the teams. So if DevOps has we have a large grocery chain in the UK that uses us. And the DevOps team is getting pressure based on user revenue, user impact, things that are client-side measurements, but they're getting pressure to measure them, which turn into generally SLOs and KPIs. How do you measure them without a telemetry source that's correlated to your backend? And then how do you create that connectivity? Because it's one thing to measure it, it's another thing to optimize and solve it. And that means you have to talk to the client-side team and have a workflow. And to be honest, most client-side teams are pretty isolated from the DevOps teams. The DevOps team obviously helps with certain things like builds and regressions and things like that, but they really should be talking like they do for other like back-end eng teams. And so to be highly optimized, that's the flow you're looking for. I also am super keen on open. I kind of mentioned it before, but most vendors in the space, they take your data and they either give it back to you in a dashboard or very aggregated form. That is not how it's going to work going forward. Like if you want to run your own analysis, if you want to run AI workflows, like if you want to actually, people are using us for risk management. They want user index data just so they can run and LLMs to see if there's risk, like on Snowflake or Databricks. You should have access to your own data. There's too many good use cases. OpenTelemetry gives us like the baseline to be able to solve those for folks, and an easy way to get to at least get our SDKs adopted, which you don't need to use us to use our SDKs. They're open source. Send the data to yourselves, send the data to wherever you want. What we provide is the extra value, the enrichment, the extra analysis for measure and optimize, the ability to send like API type data like metrics, logs, traces to your backend in a format that helps you do SLOs. Like OpenTelemetry fits really nicely in that. And to be honest, like it's also just nice to be part of that community. Like it's hard to be open source, but it's actually way more fun than not being open source, but truly open source, not just dabbling, like putting yourself out there and letting people just rip into your SDKs is pretty insightful and kind of fun.
Yeah, I totally agree. And so do you allow, I like the idea of using the data to use it in your data warehouse and doing other stuff like in Snowflake. Do you allow to export your data, or have features to export it and import it into a data warehouse or something?
100%. So the where, you can do it in two ways. You can either use our SDK, which is open source and it's free. It's just a fork of the OpenTelemetry. And to be honest, we're trying to get the SIG to adopt it, but it's just a slower process. You can use it and just send the data straight from our SDK to wherever destination you want. It's more raw. It definitely has some complexity because there'll be sessions and things like that, which you're probably not built to handle, but it's raw. So fine, use it, send it to Databricks or Snowflake or to Grafana or your Elk Stack or whatever. Or if you use us, we'll take the data, enrich it, because we'll collect a ton of more types of stuff and we know what to do with it. And then we have a series of APIs that lets you just take whatever you want in whatever format. If you want all the raw data, totally fine. You're probably not sending it to Datadog because your bill will explode. But we also give you APIs that are aggregated, like a metrics API that's aggregated, and you can decide what you want to send for those teams that want to use like a Datadog RUM, but it's too expensive or it's too cardinal. You use us, and then you actually get the tools you need in Datadog on the back end anyway. Just your client-side teams are happier because they have a tool that's built for them.
The data in OpenTelemetry is tagged, right? And they use the semantic convention for things. But as far as I know, most of that is for the backend, right? And backend technology. Did you have to basically build your own semantic convention for mobile, or can you reuse something? Or how do you tag all the data from a mobile phone? I can see a lot of things that are necessary to do, right?
Tagging is a very open concept, so you can kind of tag however you want, for lack of a better way to put it. And we're starting to reach my limit because I'm not in the code anymore. Yeah. I'm not allowed to be. They'll yell at me.
Yeah.
But from an index standpoint, we generally do it on user or on session for the way we think about the data, because that's how you ultimately want to use us. Like if you have an optimization, you may want to look up the user. I call it the CEO use case. Like everybody's CEO uses the app and they always come with the random stuff and you just want to look them up and see what happened. And any session, not just the ones with errors, which is what everybody else does, like even the good sessions. So you can compare, or maybe a good session was actually bad. So you index by user or by session so that you can combine the data and actually produce it in a more visual, we call it the timeline. A lot of companies do it that way now, where they allow you to kind of visualize everything in a temporal sense, as opposed to a more kind of, I call it horizontals versus verticals. Most tools look at the vertical events, like a network call has a time span, but most companies assume it'll just finish. So they think of it as like an event. But from an overall tagging, I'd have to get back to you.
No worries. I'm also, by the way, I'm also not allowed to touch our code. The dangerous thing, if you are the CEO and I used to be a coder, but I actually haven't coded since 2009. So
I dabbled when I was at Scopely once in a while, like Unity, and built some games by myself. But yeah, not really since 2012.
And now with ChatGPT, we can go back, right?
I haven't done it in a while. Push a PR one like once in a while just to freak people out, and it'll be like a website change or something. But I haven't done it in a while. Maybe it's time.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, but so I was thinking about RUM, right, and the way I see RUM, I stumbled upon a blog post. It was called Observability 3.0 by Hazel Weekly, and she has written a really nice post about Observability 1.0, 2.0, and now 3.0. And 3.0 was basically, it's not the only thing, but it was basically saying, okay, let's connect the business with the development teams in Observability 3.0, right? And I always wanted to do that at Instana, and when you do that and when you think about it, and the way I always thought about it is that you can't really do it without RUM, because mostly, not for every business, but for most business, think about the store that you mentioned, or a game or whatever. Your business is around the user, right? And the user is on your client side and does most of the things. Like a session is how many articles have you watched in the shop or whatever, right? So this is really your business, right? And so I think you can't really create observability 3.0 without the RAM part, right? So how do you see this business? I mean, on observability, you can say that none of the business users will ever log into Grafana or Datadog probably and look at those dashboards. They are very technical, and that's fine, right? They solve the problems of an SRE, platform engineer, and a developer. But I really like the idea of having business metrics in your observability tool, because otherwise you just copy similar data to a warehouse and then you create business dashboards. So I could imagine that for you, this is really a really nice use case, right? Having more business users on your tool. Do you support that already, or do you have plans to do so?
We do have business users in our product as opposed to a backend product that maybe you'll see it in a backend if you use traditional Grafana, not necessarily Grafana Cloud, like a widget, and you build a KPI and send it off and have like a business dashboard, but it's kind of different that's definitely different than observability. But we do see product managers, UX using us. It's not necessarily a core use case. Our love is engineers and DevOps.
Yeah.
And so we don't necessarily want to veer, but we've thought about it. I mean, getting into really academic, if you think about the core of metrics, like there's definitely a Venn overlap with product analytics. The amplitudes of the world, I mean, they're using metrics. It's just the use cases for how you analyze the metrics are slightly different and not as timely. They're not necessarily looking at real-time data when a DevOps or engineers really wants it very, very timely. Like days and weeks matter. But I'm with you. I mean, that's our core use case. It's how do we convert user impact into prioritization? So it's not just like on the back end, it used to be SLAs. I think that's table stakes. That's probably not even observability 1.0. Like uptime is just assumed. I'd say same thing for crashes, 99.9%. It's just assumed that you'll be there. It's what's next. And honestly, I think the teams are sitting there getting pressure to value themselves. Like if you're a large DevOps team, and cost is being crunched in a downturn, you better show your value. And if it doesn't tie to business impact, which you're right, ultimately is a user, you're not really making a use case for yourself.
It's kind of interesting, right? If you look at you named Amplitude or there's Mixpanel, we are using Posthoc. If you look at those tools, what they do is essentially they are sending events, right? You say, hey, somebody clicked here, and then you apply tags on the event. So the data is very similar what we do, right?
Yeah.
And the data is essentially created on the client side, either in web or in your app. So I would say like from 1,000 feet, right? If you look at it, it is very similar.
Yeah.
And
contributes, right? It's open
exactly.
telemetry.
So I can definitely see that, especially with a RAM tool like yours, you could build, your data is even more dense, right? You have more data. You have every session. You have data about the performance. You know if it's crashing, if it's slow. So the combination of that data with just the data that you have this event, what's happening, that combined could be massively valuable for product, for business, but also for the engineers, right? So I was definitely asking myself, why is there no trend that those categories kind of merge together, right?
I think there will be, and there's been talk, but it takes time. I think especially open telemetry, we're pretty early in the overall adoption cycle of it, that I think it will happen. The question is just not if, but when. And we may need a little more time for it to happen. But the product managers pushing on us, the business users pushing on DevOps with SLOs and that trend, I'm totally with you. I think the key is for the DevOps persons listening and SREs, like it's not unique user charts and geo charts. It's like really understanding the real impact. Like those are pretty, but they're not actionable. Like knowing when a specific API call actually freezes a user, right? That's the golden mark, as opposed to just knowing that an API 400s doesn't actually mean that it's actually impacted user on the client side.
Yeah.
And vice versa. The client side could have network calls that never hit the back end. A lot of folks on the back end don't realize it, but like you were kind of mentioning it earlier, but the network that the network is up and working and the throughput exists for your mobile phone is not a safe assumption. So a
Yeah.
lot of calls don't make it to the back end. And so it's like you're just blind to it. So shit's happening. You just may not be aware of it. So it's important to have both sides of the equation.
And I can also imagine that apps are making a lot of calls to backends, which are not your backend, right? I can just imagine that you call different services like PayPal and other services, and probably also App Store services, whatever that you would that will never touch your backend, right? So
you have no visibility. Like the fantasy sports app, a lot of those network calls that they were making that we were measuring were ad tech calls, right? That's third-party vendors. Exactly. You're laughing. Ad vendors are, as I came from an ad space once upon a time, so I say it lovingly. They're not policed, so they don't always have the best user experience in mind. They're a lot of times they want their network calls to fail. It's cheaper for them because if it doesn't hit their backend, they don't pay for the call. But that's not great for the app. But you have no measurement of it, and then often they're in the startup. Like they want to cache. They don't care about everything else you're trying to do to get that app loaded. So they'll bloat in the startup just to make sure that when the ad's ready to be called, they make money. And so you got to police it. So I'm with you 100%. Like there's a lot of those edge cases that are kind of obvious when you talk about them, but in reality, they're really hard.
Yeah, I can imagine. That's why probably to come back to my first question, right? Why are the vendors not really focused on it? Because it's a very unique space, right? Where you have to have domain knowledge, you have to have the experience how to do it. You can have it as a side project, but I think if you want to do it really well, you have to focus on it, right? It's a own category, basically.
Its own persona too, right?
Yeah.
It's client-side engineers are very different.
Yeah, no podcast without my AI questions, right? Because AI is everywhere. So, and for observability, I have always two parts. Let's start with the part, we see that almost every of our customers is now using an LLM somewhere. So it becomes part of your normal application stack and you have to observe it, right? You have to monitor the LLM. So it's kind of becoming the standard. And OpenTelemetry has already some libraries doing it. How is that on the mobile phone? I mean, at least at Apple, I know that they do it on the phone, right? So, do you have functionalities to monitor LLMs to figure out if the prompts were correct or the answers were good? So, do you have some functionality there, or do you see the demand for LLM monitoring on mobile?
So on the phone, apps are running AI LLMs, and Apple has released kind of technology to help that. That's one piece. Are we using, I guess, AI as well ourselves on the phone is the second. The first one is so early. There have been a lot of startups over time that have tried to help companies run AI. I mean, it's from a cost and efficiency standpoint, it's pretty obvious use case, just really hard. It's an edge computing use case. Like if you can push all of your AI to the users and the users' expectations are for things to be instantaneous, that's going to happen 100%. Can you use the resources on the phone effectively to not blow up the user experience or freeze the app? Not yet. Like very simple AI, but most of it's still done on the back end and pushed to the phone. And in terms of results, like your recommendations, things like that. I do hear a bunch of startups trying to start using the capabilities of Apple. I'm sure Google will come out with their own. But I haven't heard anything specifically yet. So for us, we're watching it, but for us to invest there yet, not knowing kind of the overall market size, it's really hard for us to go after it.
But it's good to understand that it's not yet, so you don't see it, but you obviously have a good view on all the apps, so it's not yet widely used on the phone. So as far as I understood you, it's more the phone is calling a service on the back end, which then sends the answer back, right?
Exactly. It will happen though. It has to. Like to preserve the user experience, even differentiate. Like if I'm a social network, they may start be doing it right at this point because their measurement is how quick things appear, right? And how well they engage users. That's a very small use case. But the early adopters are generally for all technologies, including mobile back in the day. It's always social, games, and one we won't talk about. They're always the earliest adopters. And so in social, they're probably happening. There's not a ton of social apps. I don't have enough data. We're in a couple, but I haven't seen anything specifically. We're in a bunch of games, but games have their own problems. So I don't think they're necessarily investing there quite yet. Right. That's a whole nother conversation for another day, but
Yeah.
monetization in games the last couple of years has been definitely tough for game companies, and I feel for them.
And then in terms of AI changing observability, and in your case, RUM for yourself, are you using it in the back end? What use cases do you see? Do you see it disrupting the space, or is it improving things? How do you see Gen AI evolving in observability especially for RUM?
Yeah, for RUM, I think it'll enhance, and that's where we've made investments. I mean, there's AI for like coding and productivity, but that's not observability. But obviously, we're invested like every tech company on that side. In the observability land, like if the ultimate measure of success is, can you measure, overuse the term, or optimize, and what's the user impact, kind of the three pieces. Where does it help? I mean, it helps you with the user impact. Like, looking for specific sessions and looking across them and trying to find patterns, knowing whether the user's impact, like when they left an app because of a freeze, is it a one-time thing? Or is it something across a lot of different users? And what are all the types of reasons it could happen? That's a total AI use case. Hard, but there. And we have the data for it, which I think is the reason that a lot of vendors haven't gone into it. They don't have the data sets, but they're not allowed to commingle across their customers. Where we're really starting to use it, machine learning and AI are basically two ends of the same coin at this point, are the ANRs. So for folks that aren't familiar, on Android, there's a concept of an ANR, which is basically an app freeze. Like when you're using an Android app, within 5 to 10 seconds, Google changes the timing for the prompt once in a while, but a prompt will pop up and ask you to terminate the app. It means the app's frozen or a thread got frozen. That's a long time to wait. And in the middle, we're like collecting code samples from as soon as we can detect it all the way to that's prompt. And then that's a total AI-ish case, because you're looking for the commonalities and the threads that may have caused that ANR, not just in that session, but across all the user sessions that exhibit that same set. It's a lot of data. We have right now, the visual is flame graph, because it's impossible for us to know the exact cause because we don't code the app. And then we use technologies to try to bubble up maybe the root cause analysis, which is a good example for it.
That makes total sense. That's exactly how we see it at the moment. So I don't see it disrupting the space, right? At the moment, right? You never know what happens when they hit AGI or whatever we call it, right? But we also use it in cases like you just explained, right? When you have a lot of data, like these threat samples, I could imagine that you have when you take these snapshots, right, during a freeze, and then you use the LLM to understand what's happening, and you try to figure out commonalities and bubble up the problem. That makes sense, and it really makes the life of a developer easier, right?
The one where I'm seeing a lot of startups is anomaly detection. It's kind of an obvious use case when you think about it, right? You have tons of data sets and you don't know which one, and it doesn't make sense for a user, which is kind of what happens today, to set the thresholds or some sort of velocity or acceleration equation on a set of data. You should be looking at all the data and trying to find the anomalies. And then the hard part where AI is helpful is false negatives. Like you never want to get alert for something that's not really a problem.
No, absolutely.
So it's always been a problem. The learning algorithms around it for even the large vendors suck. And so I think that's an obvious use case. I've seen a lot of startups. Are they end up to be controversial? Are they independent companies? Probably not. But it's definitely a problem to be solved. And they'll just get gobbled up by companies like ours.
It was fun talking to you. It is really a space I'm super interested in. I will be watching Embrace, and I'm happy that you are there with OpenTelemetry. And I see that this is a growing space, right? I mean, every application will probably be a mobile application, right? So
that's my goal.
Yeah.
Thanks for having me. I mean, I love your background, especially with the Dash Zero and Instana. Like, your questions were really awesome. So I appreciate it.
Thanks, Eric. And talk to you soon. Thanks for listening. I'm always sharing new insights and insider knowledge about observability on LinkedIn. You can follow me there for more. The podcast is produced by Dash Zero. We make observability easy for every developer.